Hi everyone, I'm Mo and I'm really stoked to be here. We're gonna try something a little bit different tonight to kind of have a proxy for what might happen in real life, which is at the beginning, you kind of walk in, you might talk to a few people, you might, especially since there's two groups kind of coming together, you might say, hey, which group are you coming from? And in order to proxy that, what we'll try to do is put everybody into 4 breakout rooms with each of the panelists and me, and kind of chat, introduce yourselves just a little bit, and then we'll come back together and kind of start the panel from scratch with us introducing ourselves more formally, and then kind of roving through some different issues in ethics. How does that sound to folks? A lot of people don't have their cameras on, but I usually just give a thumbs up sometimes. Awesome. Yay. Okay, cool. Looking forward to this experiment. Thanks for bearing with our attempt to kind of foster community worldwide. Maybe they're in Zoom limbo. Anyways, to get you kind of like to let y'all know how kind of what we're hoping the flow of the night's going to be is that each of the panelists kind of has a specialty or a special interest within ethics. I think one thing that I just want to emphasize before we kind of go into the night, based on even all the different interests that people in my room had and like what part of ethics they'd be interested in hearing about, is that data and tech ethics or AI ethics is a huge thing. And so everybody that works in it kind of focuses on kind of a different aspect of it. There's some basic principles that we'll particularly focus on during the first part, but then beyond that, some of the applications of ethics really matter based on your domain knowledge and context-specific applications. And so just I want to start the panel a little bit with kind of that in our minds and invite y'all to kind of, so we can move beyond, both incorporate concepts like fairness and bias, but then also move beyond that to see what our kind of own agency and power is within kind of applying tech ethics to our data work. And anyways, cool. With that in mind, and it's also good to see so many more faces on video. And I also totally understand if you're not putting on video, because I do that too at the end of the day. All right, so I'm Mo. I have been in Tennessee for the past several months, but I've been in San Francisco for several years. My first part of my career was actually in public health. So this current moment is really relevant. Through public health, I got very interested in the different ways that vulnerable groups were kind of incorporated into data and research. When I moved to San Francisco, I got into tech, saw some of the same issues, got involved with tech ethics. And then now with COVID, I'm figuring out ways to combine those two. So really excited to be here and also meet all of y'all, which feels like kind of the nexus of some of like the health and data community in the United States as well. I am joined by 3 amazing panelists. A couple of them I've known a while, one of them I just met, and it's been wonderful. All of them have kind of some specialties that we're gonna like touch on throughout the course of the talk. And then hopefully throughout it, we'll give y'all opportunities to ask some questions. We'll take a break right in the middle, and at the end, we might go back into breakout rooms for more kind of community-based discussion. So that's the plan. I will let y'all introduce yourself. We'll start with Emily. How does that sound?
Sounds great. Hi, everyone. I'm Emily. I'm a senior data scientist at DrivenData. And DrivenData, we are a data science and machine learning consultancy in the social good space. And so this means that we work with nonprofits and NGOs, research organizations, socially minded private sector companies to really help them use the tools of data science and machine learning to increase their impact. Apart from our direct consulting work, we also devote some time to building open source tools that let us give back to the data science community, one of which is focused on data ethics. And so that's what I'm going to talk a little bit more about today.
We'll go with Charlotte.
Hey everyone, I'm Charlotte. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a data and analytics associate at the Climate Reality Project. So right now I'm working on using data and quantitative insight to evaluate the impact of our climate education programs and inform our climate advocacy strategy. Before getting really kind of deeply into the climate space, I worked on a number of applied community-based research and data projects. including investigating community claims of racial disparity in foster care removals, addressing equity concerns in the provision of homelessness services, and modeling member engagement in a youth climate movement, in addition to some work with ACLU of Colorado on ending money bail practices and minimizing the realm of the carceral state. So I'm super passionate about applied community-based data work, and I'm sure you'll hear a lot of examples from each of those projects later on tonight. Excited to get to talk to everyone.
Awesome. And now from Numa.
Hi, I'm Numa. I'm a data scientist at the Global Disinformation Index, where I work on detecting and demonetizing the spread of online disinformation. I have been in the disinformation space for a couple years now. So before this, I was working with New Knowledge, now known as Yonder, where a lot of the work that I was doing was detecting and understanding influence operation at scale. I'm really excited to be here and talk through some of the challenges of working in a field as nuanced as disinformation and a lot of the ethical considerations that come along with it.
Awesome. Thank you all for introducing yourselves. And I'm looking forward to get started. We thought that the first thing we do is start with the kind of most concrete part of ethics within tech. And we're going to have Emily introduce a toolkit and use that as kind of a focus of how we kind of build up the conversation from there. We'll talk for about 20 minutes with a few different questions and then open it up for questions for about 10 minutes. Feel free to either type them in chat and we'll kind of keep an eye on that if that's your preference, or if you'd rather kind of in about 20 minutes, maybe 15, ask a couple questions out loud to the group, then we'll be happy to do that as well. All right, Emily, I'll let you kind of show what the toolkit can do, and then I'll have some questions for all of us.
Awesome. So great. I'm going to screen share in a bit, but I imagine people might have some screen fatigue, so I'm just going to talk for a little bit to start. So as I said, we built an open source tool focused on data ethics, and it's called Dion. And what Dion is, it's this command line tool that lets you easily add an ethics checklist to your data science projects. And so what we had seen is that a lot of conversations about data ethics and ethics in AI can be relatively theoretical and vague, and they can remind us of the importance of data ethics, but they don't often tell us what we should be doing about it, right? And so there's kind of this gap between not wanting to do harm, right? This idea of do no harm, and then actually in practice, like what does it look like to be checking for different ways that we could unintentionally be causing harm? And so that's why we started thinking about like, how can we basically help data scientists actionably engage with data ethics and really integrate that into our workflow? Because for a lot of these things that seem like technical questions, they actually have these big ethical implications that we want to make sure that we're spending time to discuss.
Excuse me. We have a couple of people who are trying to get into the meeting, Raylight and, oh my God.
I'm not entirely sure what that was about.
Why don't you add that to the chat? Sorry, Emily. Why don't you just add that into the chat and we'll handle it.
All right, cool. So we'll continue on. We can figure out waiting room stuff too. Great. So getting back to Dion, I'm going to share my screen here just to help make this a little bit more concrete. So what I'm showing you here, this is the homepage, dion.drivendata.org, which has all of the information that you'll need, so you can check this out later, but I just want to highlight a few things here. So first, as I said, Dion is this command line tool that lets you add a checklist. So what does that actually look like? So I want to actually start with the checklist to give you a sense of what we're talking about here. So the ethics checklist is divided into 5 sections. We have data collection, data storage, analysis, modeling, and deployment. And this is really meant as a reasonable starting set of questions that can help us surface the different ethical implications that come up over the course of the data science process. This is not intended to be the like be all end all set of questions that will get you all the answers. This is meant as a really helpful way to go from these kind of big picture principles into the questions that can help us have these discussions that we need to have on our teams, right? And so when we think about data ethics, we want to remember that ethics is hard, it is nuanced, right? We expect reasonable people to disagree, and oftentimes there's not one right answer, right? And so a lot of these questions, when we start to look at these and we see things like collection bias, like have we considered sources of bias that can be introduced during data collection, or things like proxy discrimination, like checking that the model doesn't rely on unfair proxies for variables. These are not specific, like remove variable X from your model, right? Because it's not that simple. And so what this is intended to do is to integrate these discussions into the workflow of the data scientist. And so that's also why it's built as a command line tool, right? So it's 2 lines to use. It's really straightforward. You just pip install it, and then you output the checklist. You can pass in a custom checklist if you have other concerns that you want to include. And the reason why we did this, we could have just created a Google document and put the checklist there and said, hey guys, here's a checklist. But it's really easy to just forget about that, right? It's now outside of the project workflow. And so this ability to output the checklist to a markdown format that then you commit to your GitHub repo and you submit a PR and you use that to start that discussion with your team, right? You can output it to a Jupyter notebook, and that makes it really easy to engage with some of these questions, right alongside the work that you're actually doing, right? And so like when you get into analysis, you have those reminders, right? And so that's why we have this checklist approach, is that it's helpful at translating these kind of big picture ideas to everyday tasks, but also because it builds habits, right? And so as you go through this and it becomes part of your data science process, the next time that you're working with a new data set, you kind of have these things in the back of your head of like, oh, but have I thought about what's not in my data and what happened in data collection, right? And so the other thing I want to say here is about specific examples, right? So this is the tool, right? You can create this checklist. It helps surface the considerations. It helps prompt those discussions. It helps you be intentional in the choices that you're making. But some of these can still feel a little vague, right? So let's get more specific. So if we take collection bias, for example, this question talks about, have we considered the sources of bias that can be introduced during data collection and survey design and taken steps to mitigate those? And so many of you will be familiar that there's a lot of research out there about designing representative samples, right, in the stats literature. And that is important, but that does not mean that we don't have any collection bias, right? Because there are things that we did not capture in our survey, right? There are even ways that we can inadvertently introduce bias in our data by the questions and the responses that we ask. So if we ask people their gender and the only responses are male and female, then we've now inadvertently excluded the portion of the population that identifies as non-binary. So that's like when you think about household survey data, but we also have this issue with passively collected data. And that can be harder to spot, but even more important. And so to give you an example of what collection bias can look like in passive data collection, I want to talk about Street Bump, which is actually the city of Boston worked to create this app. I'm in San Francisco, but I figured since many of you are in Boston, it'd be helpful to have a local example. So the idea behind the Street Bump app was that it was going to use your accelerometer and your GPS data from smartphones to detect potholes. And so on the surface, this seems like a great idea, right? Because we're using passively collected data, we're not bothering people, we're understanding where potholes are, we can make more data-driven investments and fix potholes more efficiently. But we need to think through, right? Our source of data collection is coming from smartphones. And so who owns smartphones and who doesn't, right? And we know things about the digital divide. We know that older populations are less likely to own smartphones. This can also be the case for lower income populations. And so by relying on smartphone data, we can end up with these unfairly discriminatory resource allocations where we end up fixing potholes in richer and younger areas, not because they have more potholes, but just because they have more smartphones, right? And so this is exactly the sort of thing that we want to be thinking about, because there are various things that we can do to address this, We can bring in additional data. We can reweight based on census data, right? We can research what that digital divide looks like and use that to counterbalance data. Maybe we even need to like supplement this and have additional people drive around to neighborhoods that we know are underrepresented, right? And so there's not this like ex ante right answer, and it's not to say that street bump is a bad idea or that using passive data collection is a bad idea. It's just understanding, right? Like, what are we missing? What do we need to have? And being able to be intentional about that.
Thank you. Thanks for going over the entire, for a lot of the checklists and that specific example. I think one thing that strikes me about it, and to open it up to all of the panel, is that one of the biggest questions I get whenever I've worked with people kind of on data projects on ethics is like, where to begin? And this gives a very practical, built into the code way, which I think is kind of amazing in a lot of ways. I think what I'm curious about focusing on a little bit, and maybe a lot of people here are too, is that, and you touched upon with kind of the data collection, is that once you introduce an ethical question, does it fundamentally change the analytical results? So like, does it matter? Do ethics matter in kind of the numeracy of like what is going to happen at different parts of the data lifecycle? And your example, I think specifically with gender, obviously it matters if you give a binary and we don't live in a binary, or with street lamps, potholes, not a city planner, but then there's different ways to kind of accommodate for and modify that. And I'm curious, Numa and Charlotte too, if there's any kind of work y'all have done where that ethical consideration actually changes the analytical outcome in a way. I'll let y'all kind of explore, one of y'all explore that first, and then hear from the other.
I can start off. I'm like, that was so cool. I'm like hearing you walk through that and give those examples. I love all of your proposals for like how to address that pothole consideration. Similarly, in thinking about collection bias, I work a lot with administrative or passively collected data, and thinking about who is not in the data and what activities are not in the data is everything to that work. So as a part of only being able to access administrative data, I only have, say, let's take the example of understanding homelessness services. Who's accessing services? What do they look like? What communities do they come from? And how are the services working for them? We only have data when people have made contact with services. So if they find another way to improve their situation, if they move out of the area, we don't have any information on their outcomes. So trying to figure out what services are working for what communities is really, really complicated as a task. And I think the fundamental question that we also came to as a part of the process, Modi, your question of how is ethics incorporated in even the outcome of our analysis? Do we treat our work as if not returning to receive services again is a good thing or a bad thing, right? Coming back to receive services again might mean your transitional housing program that was supposed to get you housing secure has failed you. But it also might mean you had a bad experience with the system and you're not willing to seek services again if you need them. It also might mean that you've gotten back on your feet through other methods and you no longer need services. And so I think the quantity that we're optimizing for can't exist outside of the super nuanced social context that we exist in, and figuring out how we want to understand and evaluate the outcomes of our processes requires an ethical understanding of all of the pieces of that puzzle.
Totally, that reminds me, so there's a piece on the checklist that speaks about metric selection. And right, as data scientists, which I think a number of us are, right, we're used to training machine learning models. Of course, we have a metric, so we can evaluate it. And so there's technical thoughts around like, well, let's not use accuracy because we have really imbalanced classes, so we'll use F1 score, right? But there's really important pieces to thinking through, like what does this metric, what is it actually optimizing for? And so like what you were saying, right, when someone doesn't return for services, that could be a good thing, that could be a very bad thing. And so like this happened, there is an article about this with YouTube where they were trying to basically train a model to have better autocomplete results for searching. And so the hypothesis was that they were using this metric around if people clicked on what was presented to them, right? Of like, You clicked on this, therefore this was like useful to you. This might have been what you were looking for. But there are various reasons why people click on things, and that can be because they're very bombastic or outrageous or vile. And so they had this issue where the algorithm kept surfacing videos with pedophilia because when those were surfaced to people, people would click on them out of, you know, curiosity or what have you. And so it's this like tricky thing around, okay, this metric is a good proxy for what I care about, but it's also a proxy for things that I really don't want to be surfacing. And so how do I navigate that? Do I bring in additional metrics? Do I have other ways of screening out that content? But right, really thinking through what does that look like in practice?
Emily, that toolkit sounds so amazing, and I think I'm going to start using it myself. Like, that was really awesome, and I'm so excited about it. And I'm sure a lot of people here will use it as well. I would like to talk a little bit about the model selection process. I think both of you talked about a lot of ways where you can, even in like a traditional model building, you can so easily introduce bias, right? And when you have simpler models, you can often kind of just go back and trace to your input data to see where it's going through the model and find a way to figure out where the bias is coming from and try to fix it. I've been working with a lot of text data for the past couple of years, and it's a space where deep learning algorithms really tend to excel. And I think there is so much of a push towards sexy data science, and even like, this is what your employers want to see, it's what your customers want to see, right? They want to see neural networks. And a really key problem in the field is it's the black box problem, right? It's the challenge of just making sense of how your algorithm is making decisions. And in that case, you can't really go back to your input data and see what your strongest features were. You have a really hard time figuring out if your model is biased, how it's biased, how do you create an ML system that doesn't really discriminate, right? And there has been a lot of recent work done in the field where you're doing like post hoc analysis to make the models more explainable. There's like attention mechanisms and a whole bunch of different things. But I do think some of those things could also be problematic in the sense where you're explaining the model after it's already making its predictions, which might not always be reliable. They can often be misleading. And I think those are a lot of things that people need to think about when weighing the options of, do I want a 99% accuracy score versus like a 92% accuracy score, right? Like, how do you allow a computer to make a decision that you can't necessarily explain as a human? Like, what are the ethical considerations of that?
That reminds me of another example that comes that speaks exactly to explainability. Let me just say that part of the reason why I have a lot of stories about times where things have gone wrong is that as part of the documentation for Dion, we created a page that basically has concrete examples of times where things have gone wrong linked to each item on the checklist. And so that's a nice way. So a lot of the things that I'm talking about, there are links to those articles or research papers. And so that's on the dion.drivendata.org link that I sent. But the story that I wanted to tell here about that explainability, interpretability trade-off was exactly that. It was in healthcare, which is, of course, an industry where we care quite a bit why a model has made a decision, because it can be a matter of life and death. And so some researchers were training this model that was trying to predict for patients who had pneumonia, basically how likely they were, what their risk of dying was. And so this was to prioritize care, so they could say, this person is a really high risk, so we're going to put them in the ICU. This person has a low risk, so we can send them home. And so when the researchers were looking at the model, they found this really odd finding. They trained a neural network, and the model basically said, if this patient has asthma and has pneumonia, they're low risk, which is not true. And then the researchers, because they were medical professionals as well, knew this, and they said that doesn't make any sense, because when you have an asthmatic patient with pneumonia, you send them right to the ICU because they're very, very high risk. And so what had happened in this model, right, is that it had picked up basically on the success of the intensive care unit. Right? And so patients who had asthma, who got admitted to the ICU, got really good care and survived. And so it wasn't until the researchers ran this logistic regression model to understand what's happening here. Why is our model making this totally wrong conclusion, that they were able to explain that. And so it just speaks to, like, there are certain cases when we really care about explainability and not just predictive power. And I think healthcare is an industry where this just comes up all the time.
Yeah, I think that example too is really relevant when we're considering how many decisions we're having to make on a massive scale right now in the middle of a pandemic. And I just want to, it's interesting too, because there's out of Canada, I think it's called READ, Research Ethics, Data Ethics. There's been a series of talks that talk about different ways that race gets inadvertently encoded into medical diagnostics. And so that happens with kidney functions, which is important in COVID, and with lung functions, where particularly Black people are negatively impacted by this because they get a different output. And that kind of race-based biology is of course not accurate and not right. And so in multiple ways, all of y'all brought up something that I think is really interesting, which is what is measured is managed, which I think is an old adage. And also, oh goodness, the Data Justice Center in the UK, Alison wrote a whole series of pieces kind of talking about this, which I'll put in the chat because I think they're really interesting. I think one thing that I'm curious about, and I think others are too, we've talked about different metrics, right? Accuracy, you know, what gender somebody is, what's the number of something. And I think I'm curious about that in two ways: how to choose, if there's possibilities to choose a better metric, sometimes, how do you assess that? And then also what happens when you're dealing particularly with a client that wants certain things measured, whether that's a, you know, kind of community client who probably has the best intentions, or maybe a more corporate client or partner that will also say they maybe have the best intentions, but might not accept that as much. I'm curious if y'all have any comments on that. Like how to balance that kind of choosing the right measurement with choosing the measurement that's wanted.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is a communication thing, where it's taking the time as a technical person to understand what are the pros and cons of different metrics, right? What are the trade-offs inherent in the different metrics? And because that arms you with a way to then talk about that with the client or the partner, whoever that is, to help surface that so that this can be like a joint decision. Because if they have the best of intentions and you present them with information that says, hey, this is why this could be problematic, then that allows you to actually have that conversation versus just like taking that on high and being like, well, we just have to do this and hope that it works out, right? But that requires that like due diligence to be able to like investigate and to like think about, in this data, based on the way that this model is structured, what am I actually measuring? And is this actually getting what I want, right? And I think that that's just part of a role as a data scientist as well, is not just thinking about like, can I write code to do this? But like, is this code actually doing the thing that I want it to be doing, right? Is this actually measuring what we care about? And if not, then like, what are the modifications that we need to make?
Yeah, I want to pick up on what you just said, Emily, and like think about it even in terms of the role of the data scientist beyond like actually writing code. I think getting to that question of what do you actually want and what are the incentives that are structured around the decision that someone's trying to make with the data and with the analysis. Because I think something that I run into a lot, especially in the nonprofit space, is a lot of folks want the best numbers possible for donor reasons, because they're worried about fundraising, because they're trying to tell a specific story. And I think when you can understand the incentives that are structuring a decision-making process in that way, then you can better understand how to help those decision makers use data in a way that is both accurate to the community that the data describes, but is also useful in ways that help them meet their needs.
Yeah, I might open it up to a couple of questions just to break it up before we kind of, you know, keep going. I know we have a couple questions in chat. Would anybody, let's see. So would anybody have a question they'd want to ask out loud, or that could even be one of your questions in chat as well?
This is Venkatesh. Hope people can hear me. So just what Charlotte mentioned about knowing the incentive models for people who are requesting the results from the analysis of the data can help figure out what needs to be done with the data or do it better. But that also inadvertently introduces bias into what you may churn out for the end users. So it seems like a double-edged sword, something that would actually swing against you in terms of ethics. You may be doing the wrong thing just to kind of provide a result that is supporting the incentive as opposed to being truthful about if the incentive is right or wrong.
I can answer that. So I think I totally hear where you're coming from. And I think to articulate myself a little better there, I think often you have a decision maker who's pushing to use a specific metric because they're trying to understand a decision point and figure out also how to meet their needs programmatically. And there, it's not so much about helping fudge the numbers to help that decision maker get away with whatever they want, but about actually meeting their needs in a different way. So it might be that a nonprofit wants to use a volunteer hours metric that isn't particularly descriptive to really be able to tell the story of what they're doing as an organization. But that doesn't make sense for the context in the way that they're using the numbers. But you might help them develop a process to tell the stories of volunteers who are coming to their organization to give time and their dedication to that work in a way that isn't misleading in the analysis process and isn't a misuse of data and statistics and like doesn't misrepresent anything fundamentally. So it's more about separating that desire to push a metric that maybe isn't the best descriptor for a situation and like helping move whatever is kind of corrupting the influence of that analysis into a more productive space where you're not misinterpreting anything, but you can still help the decision maker get what they need in order to make the decision they need to make.
Awesome. I can take the question about how can we find disparities in existing or proposed models before they cause problems. So in the same way that as data scientists, when we train models and we look at how well they're doing based on a set of metrics, this is exactly the time we want to be investigating the predictions of our model and understanding them, right? So there are things that we can do that are, after we've trained our model or prototyped it, but are far before we go deploying it, where we can check for fairness across groups and we can say, do we have similar error rates, or are we really just predicting well on white Americans and not Black Americans, right, in this model, for example. And like that's the time when we want to not just take the high level like, oh, it's got 90% accuracy, but do that like investigative piece to say, hey, what's happening here? Why are predictions getting made? What are the variables that it's using? Are those variables, could they be proxies for other things? And so with this, I don't want to make it sound like this is an ex-ante thing that at the start of the project, you like decide this is the set of things that we're gonna do. This is very much as you're going through that data science workflow, as you're doing analysis, as you're getting into the data, right? You're doing that exploratory data analysis and seeing, hey, we have really imbalanced classes. That could bias our model, right? So when I get to modeling, I need to make sure that I'm thinking about that and undersampling or oversampling, or there's a whole set of things that you can do there. Same thing after your model's trained, that sort of diagnostic work. And so this is like just part and parcel of the process. This is not intended as a one-off thing, but is really just kind of as you're going through it. And then even when you get into like model deployment, so that side of the checklist talks about things like redress and like rollback. And so what happens if after we've deployed our model, we find out that it is causing harm and we did our best, right, to check for these things, but unforeseen things happen. We want to think before we deploy, do we have mechanisms that allow us to roll back the model, to stop it if it's causing harm, to address harm that's been caused. So those are the sorts of things that we can still think about before the model's been deployed that set us up better to address if there's harm caused later on.
I think what both of y'all highlight and what the questions also highlight is that because this is a multi-step process, right? So the toolkit went over the entire data lifecycle or parts of it, that different decisions are made. And it seems to be that there needs to be almost a consistent documentation, or at least an effort to document at all the processes so that people can go back and see what happens, or that people that are affected by the data or the modeling decisions can see how they've been affected and comment or protest on that. I think that kind of brings me to something else we have been discussing. We've talked a little bit about explainable AI and some of the limitations for that a little bit. I think I loved what you said, Numa, a post hoc analysis that kind of explains it, but maybe doesn't fix it, right? And I think one of the things that I would like to ask next is maybe a different way to look at explainability, or something that should happen before, is this concept of accessibility to the data or accessibility to the decision making. And I'm wondering what that even means in something like open data or kind of open source, or even what this group might be doing with community partners. What does accessibility mean if you actually need access to things like GitHub and coding and additional knowledge, particularly when we're in the context of trying to serve different groups that may not have the technical know-how. You know, I did not come from a coding background, and so sometimes had to ask for extra questions throughout the process when I got involved in projects. So any thoughts on that? I know Numa did a really nice critique of explainability, and I'm curious if you have any comments on more on that, or like the difference.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of technical gatekeeping within the field. I think that within open data, data sets don't necessarily speak for themselves. So I think to understand or make sense of the data, you definitely need very thorough documentation, which usually isn't there. And I think not having the context behind the data or truly understanding does end up leading to a lot of the issues that we are talking about. I think that with an open source, we definitely need to have more of a responsibility to making sure that our code is, our data is more accessible. Our code is, at least in a way where you can kind of explain what it is doing to a person who isn't very technical. So like maybe they aren't going into the repo and just pip installing it and running the code, but do they know what is going to happen for someone who does do it? Like, can we be transparent about that? Like, what are the limitations of the code? What are possible like biases or anything we can introduce if, let's say, you don't use the data set that they're using? Or I think little things like that, maybe big things like that. So yeah, a lot of technical gatekeeping that we should probably be mindful of.
Yeah, I think even just things like reproducibility, right, is huge. Have we written code in a way that allows us to find an error if there's an error, right? Do we have ways that make it easier for other people to read the code? And like that, I totally agree with you. There's a ton of gatekeeping, and that requires language familiarity, like code familiarity, programming language familiarity. But I think even just within the technical world, we can do a better job at making things more transparent, right? More auditable, essentially.
If you're open for question, a general question to data science folks in the panel, maybe the panelists and even other participants, how often does your team or other data science teams that you've encountered provide a list of threats to validity, or substitute an appropriate adjective instead of validity over there or now, along with the models that you toss up for production? This is typical in software engineering, empirical software engineering papers to state, here's a set of threats to validity based on the experiments that we've conducted and the observations that we provide. How prevalent is this practice in the data science community?
So I think, yeah, so what I might do is, I think that's a really broad question. I think we might have also kind of a document at the end, and that's a question that almost anybody here could answer, about like self-examining what's kind of going on. Why don't we have kind of a parking lot document too, so that at the end, when we break out into breakout rooms, we can talk about more specific things that maybe affect somebody's particular data project. How does that sound to y'all? The other thing I was going to say that I sometimes follow, does everybody here do like sci-fi? Maybe not. So Cory Doctorow, does anybody read his books? He does this really, really interesting thing with panels where he tries to kind of always try to switch around a little bit, whether it's a woman asking the question or a man asking the question. And I might play with that a little bit, and that the next person that gets to ask a question out loud is a woman or a person who identifies as a woman or non-binary. It's obviously not perfect because we do live in a non-binary world. How does that sound to everybody? Kind of thumbs up. Okay, cool. But thank you for your question. It's always fun to have participation and interest in this. Yeah, I think too, so talking a little bit more about kind of accessibility and this gatekeeping, I think one thing that's also interesting too is that we're talking about the gatekeeping in terms of accessibility to being able to have insight into the decisions. And some of these decisions have incredible power in determining the outcome of a person's life. So I guess a popular book on that was Weapons of Math Destruction. But more recently, and I think this is kind of important to consider during an economic crisis, too, is that increasingly now we're embedding algorithms in different ways that people make hiring decisions. So before it actually reaches a person, then we basically have kind of a machine going through, and we know that biases can be introduced through word and, mispaired word embeddings that are based on kind of an old society rather than a society we want to create. I am very curious about, even beyond this technical gatekeeping, what are the ways that kind of social gatekeeping of older world kind of mentalities get encoded into the algorithms? Are there any kind of ways to correct that or start to address that either technically or through kind of conversations? Are there, what's the explainability of social gatekeeping in some way so that it can be fixed?
I can start out here. I'll drop a link in the chat to one of my favorite articles on this topic about specifically hiring algorithms. And one of the funny examples that shows up in it is a company pitching a employee resume screening algorithm where once they kind of did a deep dive into the features, the two most predictive features for job performance were if your name was Jared and if you played high school lacrosse. And so while those things were incredibly predictive in the data set they used, not something we necessarily want to be socially reproducing. And it also talks about Amazon having a similar problem in trying to build a resume screening tool for almost a decade. And no matter what they did, the algorithm would systematically rank female applicants lower. And if the word women appeared, like in women's sports or I went to a women's college, it would count against that applicant. And so I think often our understandings of bias in the way that we use data are limited to whether the data is more biased than the social system which is creating the data. And I think often because we stop there, we miss a whole huge chunk of the ways that we're replicating and socially encoding a lot of these systems. I saw someone dropped a link in the chat to like a futuristic predictive policing system. This is another way, right, that we take the past and we push it on to the future by encoding the biases of the past into our data because we can only train on historical data. So especially with predictive policing, if you send more cops to a neighborhood, there are going to be more arrests in that neighborhood, which precipitates this cycle. And so I think as data scientists, we have to push ourselves to think beyond minimizing bias that steps above the social biases that we see and think kind of deeply about the questions that we all kind of struggle with being in a society. Like, what do we want these systems to look like? And I think that's a big question we all have to answer a lot.
Yeah, I would just like to echo that and say that your algorithm is only as good as the data you put in it. It's really just going to tell you what your data is.
Yeah, I want to third both of those. It's so, like the Amazon example is so interesting because they did the like investigative thing into saying, hey, we know that this is biased against women, so like let's try to fix it and let's remove gender from our model, and like what is it predicting? And yeah, it's like picking up on like, you know, women's sports, but it's also picking up on language, right? Language that women are more likely to use than men. And so this gets exactly to like what Charlotte was saying about these, and Numa as well, these like social structures where we don't want to use the algorithm that's systematically biased against women, but we also know that our current hiring processes, that all of us hold lots of implicit biases and also judge people based on language and a whole host of factors and physical appearance and like, right, all of these things. And so it's a really tricky problem, and it's often set up as like, oh, this is more biased than, is this more or less biased than the humans? And so that's why I really loved what you said, Charlotte, about like, it's not just this like comparison of like, which one's worse, but like, what do we want the system to look like? I really like that.
Yeah, I loved the phrase push the past into the future too, because I think that's really important. I will say one comment on that Amazon algorithm that was discriminating against women applicants. It took them 2 years to fix it, and I think it was because of a kind of PR thing. So they were aware that there was a problem, and just it wasn't cost effective, I think, to fix it in some ways, which is very infuriating and makes you kind of think about the different incentives. With that too, I think, you know, talking a little bit more about hiring algorithms, because that affects all of us so much. Some of the newer hiring algorithms actually rely on kind of identifying different facial expressions and facial features. We know that facial surveillance does a worse job identifying Black faces. And even though, you know, there's been this moratorium on facial surveillance technologies, I think by IBM and Amazon, or at least the research and deployment of them for at least a year until there's better kind of regulations around that. Companies such as HireVue, which maybe aren't as broadcast as the big, you know, 5 tech companies, are still deploying this technology. I'm curious if y'all have any comments on kind of the different ways that racial bias and gender bias, but I think in acknowledgement of the Black Lives Matter movement, I'd really like to focus on the racial bias and how that gets introduced and different ways to kind of address that, both not so much technically, but then also through kind of power building and consensus outside of the tech community.
So just from a technical perspective, and then I might punt it over to Charlotte to talk about like the broader systems. I feel like a lot of the things that we talk about in Dion and like in the checklist are things where like data scientists have a particular responsibility, but they're not the only people that need to care about data ethics. And so I feel like this example of facial recognition gets to that broader piece where it's not just like, how do you do this ethically, right? And so there are things we can do there in terms of like the data sets that it's trained on, right? Part of the reason why we're so bad at identifying Black faces is because we don't have, like our data sets are like predominantly white faces, right? And so there are pieces there, but then there's this much broader piece around like, how is this technology being used? What is the accountability structures there? Is this ethical to create, given that there are so many potential uses and abuses of the model? And so it's not just this like, how, like, I don't want to just frame it as in like, how can we do this unethical thing ethically, right?
Yeah, I think it's one of the limitations that you have when you are working as an individual person as opposed to a collective body, because as an individual data scientist, there's only so much that you can do with what you have, as opposed to working as a collective body where you can actually work through the implications of the model and how you would actually go about addressing it.
Yeah, I can hop in as well. Like Emily, to build on your point, not even just are there not enough Black faces in the data sets we're training people on, but there is racial bias fundamentally encoded into the process of photography, because photography is normalized based on white skin colors. And so I think to step into the like kind of bigger scope of the social level of these things, when a lot of the questions about facial recognition, especially used by the police, were kind of coming up in data science spaces, a lot of folks were talking about how these facial recognition algorithms were less predictive for Black faces and what the implications of that would be in a crime space. And there were a lot of data scientists who care a lot about racial justice who were speculating that this actually might be a positive thing, right? Like making people less visible to the surveillance state as a positive thing because they were less likely to be recognized. And there were a lot of jokes about like being less likely to be killed by robots, like in the facial recognition future. And I think what we've actually seen is because they're systematically worse at recognizing Black faces, there's starting to be more and more cases where someone is misidentified as a suspect because the recognition algorithms work less for Black faces. And then that shows up as evidence against them. If there's a 98% match with your face and a blurry other face of someone of your race, but it's not you, that's evidence against you even if you're demonstrably innocent. And so I think even thinking about the ways the biases play out in the social context in which they exist, I think that's where even biases that seem like they might favor a group in making them less visible to like harmful forces can eventually be weaponized against them.
I think that part is really interesting too, the whole, I think when we're talking about kind of eliminating bias or trying to, sometimes we don't take into account that the harm has been perpetuated by a system long before we're actually creating an algorithm. So in this case that Black people can be hurt by recognition and can be hurt by lack of recognition. It feels kind of screwed as you do, screwed as you don't. And that a lot of the kind of technical fixes often happen a little bit too late. I'm curious too what that means for actually kind of doing this, the context of data work. And if y'all can comment a little bit on how to include people in like kind of the pre-data aspect of doing data and tech types of things in a more ethical way, if that ethics also has to include the participation and power of people and how to do that, or if you've seen anybody do it well. And the answer might be is that people don't do it well, and that's part of the problem. You know, I know in Silicon Valley, less than 2% of engineers are Black. You know, I don't know what the percentages of Indigenous or Latinx, you know, but what does that mean for the entire, yeah, I'm leading the question out with the answers I want, but I'll let y'all talk.
I can hop on first. I think this goes to the missing perspectives item on the Dion checklist, which is like who's in the room when you're having these conversations. Emily, I think to the example you brought up earlier, right? They only figured that out because they were doctors, right? Like they only knew something was wrong in that process because they were doctors. And this is something I think about a lot as someone who is often looking at data that does not involve me as someone who's directly impacted. And I think the most complicated example of this in my work is doing work looking at racial disparity in removals for Black children in foster care, right? That's a circumstance that we also cannot directly involve participants in that system, in that analysis, because of confidentiality reasons, because they're children, because they're deeply traumatized frequently. And I think this question is a lot easier to answer the more accessible the folks in your data are, and the more you can get community stakeholders around a table. This looks different for every context, whether it's a business, whether you're looking at your consumers, whether you're looking at your constituency, in different kinds of places. But I think who is at the table shapes what you know about how processes work. So a lot of times what we see in community-based data work is when you actually involve people with lived experience, they're able to point out systematic holes in systems or in processes that like you never would have noticed in data, right? You might be offering an incentive system for someone to participate in a program, but it doesn't work if they don't have access to the bus because it doesn't run at that time. So unless you can understand the components of the system that exists outside of the data and what you can measure, you often can't get to the heart of the questions you're actually trying to measure or know what's useful to measure, to go back to the kind of metric selection question.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was a comment earlier in the chat that was asking whether this is like outside the responsibility of data scientists to think about discrimination. And I feel strongly that this is part of the data scientist responsibility, and it doesn't require like this entirely separate education. We shouldn't think about it as being entirely separate, right? We have the variables in our data set to understand how they're related to each other, right? And so taking that discrimination lens is not only part and parcel of like exploring the data, but it's also just, I think that there's an inherent responsibility of data scientists to understand their data. And so sometimes that means going to stakeholders and saying, hey, like, we're trying to understand this variable. Like, we do this all the time at DrivenData because we work in a ton of different industries. We do stuff in financial inclusion, we do stuff in healthcare, we do stuff in education, we work in like conservation research and like identifying animals in camera trap videos. I mean, like super disparate things. And so like, we can't be experts in all of those fields. And so part of our process is spending time with the client and going through the data and sharing our understanding, right? We've explored the data. This is what we think these things mean. Is this correct, right? Are we, like, we're seeing this finding. Does this make sense to you? And those are the conversations that let you start to understand, like, oh, this data is, you know, this part of the data is fundamentally different or came from a different process, or look more about that additional context, right? We've also done work with IDEO.org, and they're a design research firm. They do really fantastic qualitative research. And so in some of our work where we've looked at like use of digital financial services and mobile money in places like Tanzania, we've done really in-depth work with them where they're doing on-the-ground research and understanding how are women engaging with mobile money, right? Like, what are some of the barriers, what are some of the bottlenecks? And then that's paired with us doing quantitative analysis. And so that's a more extreme example of like pulling in the understanding of like what's happening on the ground and then what's happening in the data. And so this isn't to say like you should always have a team of qualitative researchers like giving you context, but just that like reflecting back, this is our understanding of the data, that we're documenting it, we're having a conversation, and at the very minimum, being aware of who's not in the room, right? Who haven't we talked to that we wish we could have, right? Just doing that reflection of like who's on our team, right? Like this case gets talked about a lot with Apple, where they, you know, designed this healthcare app so you could track all these like super crazy things about your health, and you couldn't track your period, right? And this is like one of the things that like a lot of women want to do, right? And like the hypothesis is that team was mostly male developers. And so like having that conversation around like who was on our team, and then even like for people that aren't data scientists who are like setting teams, right? Thinking through like, how are we building teams on an organizational level, right? This is like that next level up of like, how do we set teams up for success? And like understand what are the blind spots, how do we fill those in, you know, at the very minimum, just being aware of what some of those are.
Yeah, I think that's all really, really interesting. And we went big and theoretical, which is where I tend to like to sit. I think we've kind of hit another around 20-minute mark. So just to kind of give you, I want to take another question from the crowd, and, you know, confirming what I said earlier and Corey, Dr. O's kind of thing. I'd really love it either if it's from the chat, or if anybody who identifies as a woman or non-binary would like to ask a question. And probably in about 10 minutes or so, me and all the other panelists are going to take a 5-minute, just turn off our screens. Anybody else can take a break too, and then come back and kind of come for the last round. So just to give you kind of a direction of the next 20 minutes or so.
There's some good questions in the chat.
Let's see. Does anybody who wrote a question in the chat would like to ask it out loud? If not, I can read one. Let's see. Some of the questions are longer. Well, so I think, sorry, it's actually hard to like read through the questions in the chat while moderating a little bit, so I apologize for that. I think there's been some comments kind of generally a couple times. Oh, it's in the doc. Yeah. Oh, are all the questions in the doc too, Ben? Not in the chat?
I just put them in the document.
Got it.
I can ask my question out loud if you want to make it simpler.
Thanks a lot. Sorry, I got blind in the headlights for a minute.
No problem. So my question that I asked was about if you collect data, initially for one purpose, what are the ethical considerations about using it afterwards for a secondary purpose? How do you validate that the context is appropriate to use it for a different purpose?
Yeah, I think this is a super important question worth asking. I don't think I have I think that that's very context dependent, right? And so I think part of it is understanding what was the informed consent portion in the original data collection, and does this permit the secondary use of it, right? Is it open data that has been, licensed for various purposes, right? Like sometimes there's that additional information. I think reaching out to organizations who collected the data to basically understand if that use is allowed is a great way to tackle that. In terms of the validity of the data, I think, and the accuracy in terms of being able to use it for another purpose, I think that's where it just becomes really important to understand what's in that data, and to the extent that you can understand the data collection process for it. So for certain household survey data sets that I work with that have been collected and are publicly available, I often look at the technical report that goes along with it to understand their sampling design, to say, okay, this is what it was sampled to do. I can use it for nationally representative. I can use it for countrywide statistics, but I can't, it's not been sampled to have validity at a district level, right? And so I think part of it is understanding what's in that data, what it was designed for. And so then you as a data scientist, I think, have to make some of that call, right? Of is this statistically valid, right? What am I missing, right? Reading the code book, if it's a survey data, that's a great way to understand what wasn't asked. But yeah, digging into that for sure.
I know this is a huge issue in kind of the quantified self and what some of the larger companies do. So Google bought Fitbit, and I use Fitbit. So it meant that I let Fitbit use my data, but now Google has access to it. And I think that's where the regulatory framework too has just not caught up in some ways, but that it becomes really problematic, because what happens if an insurance company buys Google?
Yeah, and I think it's just tricky also just as a civilian, not even taking off my data scientist hat and being who has access to my data, and did I consent to that? And there were a lot of terms and conditions, and what do those actually mean? I think it's really hard just as citizens to understand who actually has access to our data, and how to control that, even being a technically savvy person. I think that we have a long ways to go in society. And maybe Numa and Charlotte can talk more about this, but just of how, I'm curious for your thoughts of how do we, what could that look like? Or how do we even get to a point where we feel we actually have control over our data? Or do we just, have we just kind of given that up given the age that we live in,
I can hop in unless Numa, you want to hop in?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think it's a difficult problem, right? I think in some ways that we almost consent to our data being used because we want better things. I think we do that maybe on a daily basis with things like Apple Watch, with our iPhones. We do it with just better recommendations on Netflix or Hulu or whatever we're doing. I think in some ways we almost consent to our data being used so we get better things. But what are the ethical implications of that? Yeah, I don't necessarily have a good answer to this, except that it's a tricky problem. And I think that we need to figure out a good balance between how much data privacy we need and how many good things we need.
Emily, I think.
Yeah, I was actually going to chime in just to say that I agree it's a difficult problem, and I don't think there's going to be an easy solution. And sometimes the ethical response is even in your tactics. So if you were to go look at, for example, Twitter's privacy policy, they've explicitly written it in a way that's not lawyer to lawyer, but to you as a citizen to understand how and why we're using your data. So yes, there's potential easy pass through, right? The risk reward or the benefit cost analysis for sharing my data. But I think there's some organizations of scale that are trying to be very pro, informational or very transparent about how and why they're using it. And again, in ways that are not just small fine print and lawyer to lawyer, but rather, us to you, to make sure that you understand the agreement we're entering into. Getting back to Emily's point about consent.
Emily, I think your point about, to your question, like, should we just give up, right? Like, we're giving away so much data constantly. And especially, we might be willing to give away data in specific contexts, but the fact that that data is packaged and resold, and in conjunction with other data that other companies have on us, is like incredibly identifying and very detailed about our lives. And this is something I think about a lot. Taking off my data scientist hat, I think often the strategies that we employ in the digital world are the same strategies that we might employ in the physical world, right? If there's surveillance around you, what are the things you can do to like minimize the effect of the surveillance on you? But in the digital world, we often limit ourselves to those like physical world creativities. So something I think a lot about is in the digital world, we have possibilities that we don't have in the physical world. So one thing you could do in the digital world is send out digital clones of yourself to go do a bunch of arbitrary things on the internet and pollute the data source. As frustrating as that might be to us thinking about using that data in any way, there are ways for kind of citizens to fight back against these abuses of power. If I can set up a bot on my computer to Google random words related to construction in Estonian, I'm gonna get really, really different Google search results and Google ads, which is gonna break me a little bit out of my algorithmic bubble. And so I think we need to broaden our understanding of how we fight back against these abuses of power into digital specific ways. Like, I can't send out people who look exactly like me to do inconspicuous things all over Washington, DC. But in digital spaces, I can do that. And I think we haven't been able to collectivize that power yet, but I think there are ways to kind of come together and like fight for our privacy and fight for our like collective rights and responsibilities in ways that are creative, if not a little bit disruptive.
I love that about kind of digital cloning and the kind of speculative fiction ways of fighting back. And I think there's going to be like an incredible, wonderful ways to do that as we kind of move forward. Yeah, so I want to give the panelists, I think this is a good time to maybe just give a 5-minute break and give anybody else here a 5-minute break, just because we've been kind of talking for over an hour or so, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit more. We thought we'd kind of finish the night looking a little bit at disinformation. So that's just a little teaser, just because that's very much on the minds and actually has some really interesting issues in terms of everything from labeling to like the narratives that are going to affect us in a month when there's an election. I hope that everybody's registered to vote one time. And also a little homework tomorrow is to call 5 friends and make sure they're registered to vote and have a plan, because we live in a democracy. So still. All right, I'm going to turn off my screen for 5 minutes. So that means at like 7:38, according to my watch, then I'll open it up again and give everybody a chance to either take a break or the non-panelists can chat among themselves too.
for folks that are still around, I think we only have another minute before everyone else comes back, but, oh, okay. I think I've missed, and people are coming back. I was originally going to say we could have some chatting in the meantime, but it looks like we're ready to get back into things.
There are a couple of good questions in the chat in text-based during the intermission. I just tried to Google 10 things to try to remember what it is, but I work at edX and our user experience team runs surveys and a lot of things where ethics are often involved. And there was some questions around what kind of ethics organizations are in the Boston area or a potential for like a Hippocratic oath for data scientists. I know in the academic space, whenever there's any sort of clinical trial or research experiment, there's often a review board that has a name that I'm sure somebody here knows the name of at like an academic institution.
IRB.
IRB, see, I got the last two words part of it, internal review board, which oftentimes will have like a checklist. So even though I'm an MIT employee, but I don't work with MIT directly, whenever we do any sort of user experience surveys, we copy from their IRB because we're not bound by them, but they provide a bunch of resources that we then read, and it's sort of a Dion-esque checklist that we think about. And other people in the university are required to get approval by the IRB before they start collecting data about people. So I don't know if that's Boston centric or something like that, but MIT's IRB does produce a lot of resources that are available to the public. I assume other universities do as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. There was an effort to create a Hippocratic oath for data scientists a few years ago, funded by Omidyar. And I think it was one of the things is that I think one of the things that data science needs before like a Datacratic oath could be created is that it has to be a profession with like kind of licensing. So that's why it works so well for physicians in particular, is because you have a medical board that can take away your license after a particular due process. And one of the amazing things about tech is also the limitation in this process is that anybody can become a data scientist. Well, anybody with access to internet, time, financial resources, but you can generally kind of jump in without getting kind of a license to do data science work. So that would be my only comment. I was involved in the Hippocratic Oath project, so I was pretty familiar with why it didn't work. I know we have a lot of questions in the doc, and what I'm hoping is at the end, in about 15 or 20 minutes, we have a couple questions here, people jump in, it's a little bit of a free-for-all, and then if people want to stay and chat, then we do it in the breakout rooms where it's just a little bit easier to have a conversation. But I wanted to get to disinformation because it's kind of close to my heart as well, and I think a really, really complex topic that gets on to a lot of the points that we've spoken about earlier, power, agency, bias, even looking at where kind of data science or tech is generally done, which is in North America, in a lot of places, and how that kind of affects some of the ways that we even look and can ethically mandate different things. Yeah, and so I don't know if any of y'all have seen some of the news recently, but Sophie Zhang was a former Facebook employee, and she released an internal memo that was reported on by Craig Silverman. I don't know if everybody's read that. That's like a huge, I've seen it all over the news the past couple of days, but that might not be what everybody's seen. And thank you, Charlotte, for dropping it in there. But effectively, the big thing that jumped out to me was that she said that Facebook was able to prioritize which narratives and where those narratives were located to the detriment of not focusing on other parts of the world. And so, for instance, they tended to focus on disinformation that was created by networks that were affecting the United States or Europe primarily, and if there wasn't enough time they never got to parts of Africa or Latin America. And so that was kind of interesting to me. And I kind of wanted to bring in too, how do we determine which things in anything we're talking about, whether they're narratives, whether they're kind of which aspects of ethics, which ones get noticed or regulated or analyzed. I'm also really excited to have Numa on the panel because she's been looking at disinformation for a really long time and some of that complexity. So I might open it up to you first, but I think the question is even broader than disinformation in some ways.
Yeah, so I think who has the power to make the decision with what narratives we get noticed it's a really, really important one. I think that especially for, I think at least for companies that kind of look at the problem from the outside, so not being a social media platform or, you know, a news source. I think a lot of that is unfortunately driven by the people that fund us. So the people who are paying us to do the research are probably interested in, you know, if they're paying us in the US, they probably would want to know about what's going on in the US. Therefore, we don't really look at narratives that are happening in Africa or Latin America or South America, which is a little concerning because those places also do have issues that we should be looking at. They do show up on our social media feeds all the time. How do we also figure out what narratives to look at then? I mean, a lot of these I think would give you, like, we're really interested in looking at coronavirus, or we're really interested in the 2020 elections. So what narratives do you even look at within that broad topic, right? And different places I've worked at have done this differently. But I think the question is really, how do we figure out what is more harmful? Is that something that we can even do? Like, how do you figure out the risk and impact, right? So are you looking at things that are not supported by facts? Are you looking at promotion of distrust in science, government, social institutions, promotion of discrimination, exclusion? Are you looking at violent criminal acts? Are you looking at harassment, dehumanizing language? What is more harmful? How is that a question that you can even, how do you answer that? It's not as simple, I think, as a lot of other fields where, I don't know, like you're looking at just things like, okay, people dying, yes, that's like the most harmful thing. I think disinformation is so much more nuanced at that because it can probably affect generations to come. So how do you figure that out?
It's interesting because even you describing the different types of harm or the different types of narratives helped make it more clear to me how to kind of start to slot what those different potentials for harm are. So I feel like there's kind of a couple issues here. There's also like, what do you label those narratives? And then going back to the very beginning, how do you manage what's measured? Like, how do you measure harm? And this is an issue, of course, in everything. This is kind of the heart and soul of at least medical ethics, which often kind of grew into other types of ethical considerations.
No, I agree. I think measuring harm or measuring risk is something that I have worked with a lot of people in the past couple of years to come up with a framework that works. And it is just so nuanced, and there's so many ethical considerations and decisions to even think about that it's not something that we've even come close to solving, right? Like I talked to a lot of disinformation researchers who come up with their own different ways of like, this is what we think is more harmful than this. But then I think that's very biased if it's kind of based on that sole person, right? They're like, okay, well, we think promotion of distrust in science is so much more harmful than promotion of discrimination. But why?
Yeah. I guess I'll open it to the whole panel, but I think that what you're bringing up also is a trade-offs in disinformation and choosing which part to focus on, but then also in ethics at large, do we choose to focus on privacy or do we choose to focus on fairness? And there doesn't have to be trade-offs with those, but often it feels like different projects tend to try to kind of bring one more into sharper relief than another. And I'm curious if any of y'all kind of think about like, what are some of the almost beyond a checklist, how do you, with limited time and resources, try to focus on a couple different things that have the most impact? And there might not be an answer to that question either, because I think it's really, really hard, and sometimes we're determined, our priorities are also determined by kind of the project that we're put on and the company that we're working for. And so I wonder to, so let's go to something a little bit, kind of within that. When we take it to labeling, Numa, you mentioned that oftentimes it's a couple different people that get to kind of label the narrative. What's the next step? Like, how do we begin to fix that?
Yeah, I think we need to maybe just move back and talk about, can we even label disinformation? And if we do label disinformation, who has the power to label it? If we have multiple people labeling it, do we have multiple, is it a diverse group of people labeling it, right? Can we make sure we're not introducing bias in our label collection, in our data collection? I think we need to try to address that first before we even have like a collection of labeled data that we are putting into models. I think that, so the company I worked at before this, we got around this problem by not labeling data at all. We were just like, we're just going to use all these unsupervised techniques because them labeling data introduces so much bias. We don't really know if we can do this, in the way that we should be doing it, which is great. But then that limits you so much, because then it's really hard for you to detect narratives or disinformation when you're only using unsupervised techniques. Sure, there's ways to do it, and we definitely did it in certain ways, but it didn't always work. And I mean, sure, like with supervised techniques, it doesn't always work either, but it does give you, you do have more options, and there's more that you can do with it. If you label data, I think it makes things a lot easier for data scientists in that way, but easy isn't always great either. So I think there's just like a lot of, things like pros and cons and just ethical considerations that you have to make and think about when you are going to go label something as nuanced as disinformation.
Mo, to your earlier question of stepping beyond a checklist, now that I've thought about it, I have an answer. I think one of the best things that you can do besides using the kind of Dion checklist to evaluate your technical work is to understand what happens to your work when it moves beyond your desk in the organization. I think data science teams and technical teams are often so siloed. And I think to Emily's earlier description of her work, right, this process of actually kind of coming in contact with the end stakeholders of your data is not standard in the field. And so I think that's definitely something that needs to change culturally. I think a good example in the disinformation space is Facebook made the platform accessible in different languages before they had moderators in those languages. So that was a technical decision that was made without consultation kind of with the broader like Facebook community to try to figure out what are the implications of making this technical decision for the way other parts of our business process operate. And I think that really speaks to the siloed nature of technical work often, which means that the ethical considerations and kind of programmatic considerations are disjointed often in how they're implemented.
Yeah, and I think that, right, there's that like what happens after. Like I really agree with your point about the problematic piece of it being siloed. I think there's also that piece before, like who's working on what? Like that's what struck me about the Facebook memo, was this person saying, hey, I had to make decisions because I was so under-resourced, and those were having implications in terms of like electoral outcomes in other countries. And there are so many people working on spam, but aren't working on this type of disinformation. And so like that's where this whole idea of data ethics requires that like organizational commitment to it, like at all levels of like, how are we, you know, not just who's on our teams, but like how many resources are we dedicating to this, to make sure that, right, because if you understand, okay, this area is getting so under-resourced, then you start to understand those downstream consequences of it. But it's, and like, I get that this gets to be tricky when you factor in profit and like what's the right thing to do with the bottom line. But I guess my point here is really just that like those conversations have to be happening like at all levels of the company. It's not just technical teams. It's like, you know, C-suite execs too.
Yeah, I think you have to think of the problem as a collective body. Like you can't just be thinking of it as a single data scientist. It just doesn't work that way.
I also think if we're calling a particular department within Facebook under-resourced, it's very much a very sharp criticism against a very well-resourced company as well. And I think that's also a really interesting thing that we should all consider, is that if we want to introduce ethics to our companies, we got to say, where is the money and the time and the personnel to actually implement this in a way like, you know, it's the heart of the company or the money of the company actually in this. Yeah.
We can't just be dotting our T's or dotting our I's, crossing our T's, and saying like, oh, you know, we did it. Like that's, you know, like even just like in the framing of DM, right? It's like, how do we have these discussions, right? Again, like how do we think about this on our team? It's not like, oh, well, I don't have gender and I don't have this, and like, oh, I have, you know, at least 5 people working on this issue. Like they're not these simple things. And so it's like, that's why we as like the tech sector have to come to terms with this, because it's not simple fixes, and it really is this like organizational discussion and like, I agree with you that there's at some point like a value, like putting that value explicitly, right? And saying like, we are going to like spend the time and the resources to do this right, and not just to like do it easily. I also, like, that being said, I don't want to make it sound like to do things ethically, you have to spend like, you know, 3x the amount of time and 3x the amount of money. I don't think that like, just thinking about my own work and like what it's been like to use this checklist in my own processes, I don't feel like it's added a dramatic amount of time and resourcing to projects. And so I don't want us to set this up as like, oh, companies aren't doing this because like it takes up too much work. I think that there's like an intentionality that comes from it of like, right, having this be part of like what's expected and what's in that routine, and it gets faster the more that you do it. But it's not that we're like writing a PhD thesis on every model with like for all of the like discriminatory effects that it could have, right? And we can still make like really significant ethical gains by like doing this consistently, even if it's in seemingly like small amounts.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'll have to sit with that for a little bit, just because I sometimes worry. I think I sometimes get concerned, like working within this field, that it maybe doesn't add too much time or resources to the particular project, or like it just takes a little bit more, but that if the entire business model is not kind of reconfigured in a way where we don't need these kind of massive profits through the exploitation of data, essentially, then I don't know. I mean, I don't want to leave it on that note, but I think it's really interesting to think about like, what is the difference we can make within our particular system, but then how do we expand from there and change bigger? I think we're reaching towards kind of, you know, does anybody have any questions before we break out into a couple breakout rooms? I also just want to give a big hand to the panelists. I think, you know, we've and everybody here as well, but especially the panelists for showing up, letting me ask random theoretical questions as they came to my mind, even though I had a few questions I'd sent to them, and just letting me kind of pick their brains and learn a lot from them. I've written some of your phrases and notes and taking that back to all my like ethical work as well. So thank you, all of you. And with that, we'll open up to a couple questions, either that I prefer if people ask them out loud because the chat kind of goes through me like a little bit quickly. And Ben's helpfully created a document that when we break out into the breakout rooms and kind of chat casually for the last part of the evening, then we can kind of address some of them too. Ah, cool. Thank you. This is an I think this is actually a really interesting question for the group. So Adam Blackwell asked if there's anybody's aware of a guide for collecting demographics or any type of kind of gender data from events, and how to use that data to help to create policies that maybe address some of the issues of making a community more inclusive. I don't know if a document exists, but I think I'm curious if any of the panelists do. And if not, would encourage either Boston Data Science or PyData at Boston to maybe think about starting to crowdsource and collect and make that document.
Thanks for throwing the impetus back on us.
I was just going to say, I don't know if a document, but I think it would be really awesome if Boston actually gets together to do it.
I guess I have, so I asked during this event, one of my closer friends who's non-binary for some advice on this, because we did a practice for physical events, but don't, and that trend data is actually quite useful for Boston Data Science, but it's poor data and I'm cautious about how it gets used because it could be used improperly potentially. The suggestion that I have, and I'll maybe put this here in case people want to do it or want to use it, is in the beginning of the event to suggest that people put their preferred pronouns. If you like expand out, I put he, him next to my name in Zoom, which you can do by like clicking on the more and renaming yourself. And then it's voluntary information. If you don't want to volunteer, then it's self-reported data. I don't know what that would look like, but I see a couple of other people doing it, so I appreciate that. And maybe we'll try to mention that in the beginning of the next event.
Yeah, I think it's really helpful to normalize that. I know, for most of the first several years of my career, that was not a normal practice, and I still have to remind myself to add it in. So.
No, I'm still thinking about your point about like this changing from like changing the fundamental structure versus like changing from within. I'm curious to get like broader thoughts on like other panelists, but maybe other people too. Like I don't know, like it's tricky because it's like you want to do something, right? And you want to do, but ultimately you don't want to just reinforce the status quo and the systems that are like causing a bunch of these inequities and like ethical issues. And so there's this balance between like starting to like integrate this data ethics into our everyday work and also like moving that upwards to be systemic change. And I just, it's tempting to say like, oh, we don't need to do like big reforms, and if only we just like are all more intentional, that's enough. And I agree with you, like your pushback that like that's not. I also think that starting with like the biggest thing can lead to inaction. So I don't know, curious for other reflections or thoughts on that.
So I previously worked at a company where we created the council. And the idea behind that was it was a bunch of us who were really interested in looking into the ethics of what we were doing, which was in the disinformation space, can be really important. So like once a week, we would get together, talk about the work we were doing, the customers that we had, how we were collecting data, what our models were outputting, especially given that we weren't fully labeling any data. So we had a lot of unsupervised techniques, just like grouping data collection, like these collections of data together, and what that really meant, like did that even make sense? So a lot of these things that we're talking about, we would kind of talk through in like this 10-15 person group, and we would try to take it to our leadership and walk them through what we were thinking, if there was anything we were concerned about, if there was something that we just didn't necessarily agree with. And I want to say that it was, I wouldn't say it was super successful, but I do think it helped. I think at the very least, it helped us be a lot more conscious of the work that we were doing. I think I was definitely more mindful of, data science work that I was doing, of the data that I was looking at, of the data that I was giving our clients, of the narratives that we were supporting. Like, I think that it, at the very least, helped all of us be more mindful of what we were doing. So maybe something like that in your own companies.
And I think too, you might not change it at that first company, but getting the practice in, when you move to the next company, you already have some fluency too, and like kind of what you know you want to talk about, and you come in and gradually shift. I think the practices of the next company, particularly as the whole industry shifts. I do think that there can be paralysis in trying to tackle the biggest problem first, but it's nice to always keep that kind of in the viewfinder. I'm kind of curious, from maybe this is a little bit of a poll, but you know, when we talk about ethics and other stuff, is there anything, I kind of like to think, so I am very worried about how disinformation will affect my life, particularly because I'm working in public health right now. But I don't know if I have kind of a daily like worry about how an algorithm is not fair enough or something like that. And in part because I am, you know, part of the educated, privileged, white class in so many ways. And I'm kind of curious if people ever get worried about the negative impacts of an algorithm, and you don't have to answer, but maybe it's just kind of a question to pose to yourself. And where that places us in terms of kind of the power to be able to talk about it and change it, but maybe not the vulnerability of having to be worried.
That's a really great point on privilege, right? Of like, are you like unavoidably worried about the impact of an algorithm, right?
And I'm terrified of Facebook's algorithm on a daily basis, you know, but yeah.
I think we all should be worried about Facebook's algorithm on a daily basis.
Yeah.
No, I think your point about privilege is like super important to consider. So just taking a quick example from work I've done in the homelessness space, I did a lot of work assessing the validity of a scale called the Vulnerability Index Service Prioritization Decision Assistance Tool, with the very terrible acronym VI-SPDAT. But essentially what the tool is used for is to determine whether folks who are seeking homelessness services should be eligible for housing. There are two kind of big housing programs. One gets people into kind of rapid rehousing, and the other is long-term permanent supportive housing. So a lot of the work I was doing on this assessment was looking at the validity of the scale and whether it's accurately assessing vulnerability in homeless individuals who are coming. This has a ton of super sensitive information from HIV/AIDS status, pregnancy status, history of domestic violence, and a bunch of really intrusive information to disclose to a stranger in an interview to kind of ask that question. But then zooming back out kind of to the privilege context, right, all of the work on that scale is fundamentally confined to the analysis of that project. And there's nothing in the domain of that analysis that asks the question, should we be assessing vulnerability as a way to gatekeep who gets access to housing resources? There's nothing about that analysis that asks the question, should housing be a human right? It just allows us to allocate scarce resources more effectively based on criteria that we determine to decide like the moral worthiness of accessing housing, or sometimes even the cost effectiveness of housing different kinds of people. So I think often when we focus on what's implicated in a specific algorithm, if we take a step back and look at the broader context in which we're operating, often the big question is kind of obfuscated by this specific work in looking at what an algorithm is doing, and looking at the broader scope gives us the real question that we should be answering and the real thing that we should be working to address, because no amount of working on this algorithm is going to increase the amount of housing available in an area.
Yeah, I love that. It's disentangling the non-technical problems from the technical problems versus saying, you know, I can write code, so here's my hammer, everything else is a nail.
I think it also means funding non-technical work as well, and advocating for that at your particular company. I'm saying that very selfishly and biased as a primarily non-technical person who's added a few technical skills. But I think that's always been something really, really interesting too, to me. I'll make I do see in one chat that somebody said that they're very worried, Adam Blackwell again said something that very worried about the talent sourcing algorithms at the tech companies. And I think that's another one where we're materially impacted often by kind of the different ways that we might be hired or not hired. And I think that's, you know, I think one thing, and I'll just reemphasize this, I think the way that we might feel worried about a particular algorithm, like materially impacted by it, is the way that so many people feel impacted by, you know, egregious policing algorithms, jailing algorithms, anything used by that, and to like kind of hold that feeling close when we think about the ways other algorithms are being deployed as well. Are there any other questions or comments? I don't know. We could break out into breakout rooms, or we could kind of keep having a little bit of a casual chat as people wind down for the night. I think this ends in about 15 minutes or so. I mean, I can talk about ethics all day, but we've kind of gotten through some of the topics we wanted to address. And Ben, you unmuted, so I'll let you talk.
I was just saying, yeah, I think it was, we had said it for 9, but it's totally fine to go over it however it works.
Awesome.
Oh, I have a question.
Go for it.
So I wrote this in the chat, and maybe the question got lost, but it seems like, and this is what I've been sort of alluding to all night, you know how like a company is going to want to make sure that it doesn't get in trouble with anti-discrimination laws. Like if you fired all of your Black employees, you would end up in a lot of hot water. Could we make algorithmic bias something that could be subject to those laws, or more easily subject to those laws? Like the example I gave with a bank that rips off Black borrowers with inflated interest rates, which is a really common thing that happens. You know, nothing's going to wake up a drowsy boardroom meeting like the phrase multi-million-dollar class action lawsuit. What can we do to make it easier for the law to help us out?
So, I mean, I think this is a large issue where we talk about kind of, I mean, this happens even beyond kind of ethics, but law and enforcement of law tends to be one of the last kind of accountability steps when we're talking about everything from ethics to human rights. Typically, a lot of that work gets really accomplished by mass organizing and democratic change, in my opinion. I'm curious what the panelists think. And I also think that some of the most effective forms of that are where you really center some of the issues that may affect some of the communities on the experiences of the community, rather than worrying as much about what the board might think, even though that can be an effective organizing technique. If it comes from that first, I think it misses the point a little bit.
Thank you. That's a really good point.
Well, I think is an interesting complicating factor in policing algorithmic bias, especially in terms of kind of lawsuits. A professor that I had in graduate school, his sister, he's white and his sister is white, and she has a name that is traditionally perceived as Black. He gets a ton of marketing directed at Black women. And so what complicates the kind of bias in the algorithm analysis is that there's a factuality gap where people are perceived in a way by a computer because of characteristics they share, but they might not actually share those on a legal basis, which might mean the group of folks that are being discriminated against is not entirely composed of the folks who like the algorithm is kind of structurally discriminating against, which weakens the claim of algorithmic bias because you can show that some of the people in that group don't share the characteristics of the structural bias. And so I think that's an interesting wrinkle when folks are being discriminated against based on like very nuanced characteristics of often digital profiles rather than actual legal characteristics, which gives us this like disjointed gap between where the law creates protected classes and where the algorithm is coding people a certain way based on characteristics that are generally shared by groups.
So go organize, go vote. I mean, I think that's the heart of part of this discussion that I think, you know, we all kind of dance around a little bit when we're trying to fix things, which is incredible. But that ultimately you can only fix things insofar as your culture, legal system, organizational structure allow as well. I will, you know, kind of, I think maybe we gradually wrap it up now. How do people feel about that? And I think in the, please feel free to contact any of us or, you know, ping us in any way. I'm on Twitter. I don't know if y'all want to share kind of your social medias, other panelists. I'll put mine in the chat. Twitter has a really, really active kind of chatting about ethics. And I think any of us would be happy you know, to come back and chat some more or hear any other questions that you might have. So. Ben's internet went out. So Ben, I was just suggesting we kind of wrap it up and I gave a couple ways to contact us and just say we really, really enjoyed y'all inviting us. So thank you to both Sarah and Ben also for organizing this and making sure we knew what Zoom link to click on and all the good stuff in this world. So
yeah, thank you, and thank all of the panelists. Thank everybody for attending the panelists and for all your really interesting comments. And I think this is a really great conversation. I feel like the chat had a really good like conversation going too. I'm gonna try and like save the chat afterward. Yeah, awesome, great job, everyone. That's great.
Yeah, thanks Mo, Emily, and Charlotte and Numa for being here and for talking and giving a lot of your expertise and perspectives. It's been really interesting and so important. We need more of these kinds of conversations.
all right, everyone have a lovely evening. I'll see y'all soon.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.